She was already carrying a child when she pulled him out of the mud, and that single moment quietly ruined and saved her life at the same time, because no one saw it happen, no one would believe her later, and she never told anyone how heavy his body felt in her trembling arms, how the rain was cold on her skin, how fear pressed on her chest harder than the baby inside her, and how she almost let go when he didn't wake up, didn't speak, didn't even breathe properly at first, but something inside her refused to leave him there, maybe because she already knew what it felt like to be abandoned by the world, maybe because she had been invisible for too long, living on the edge of a small village where people looked through her instead of at her, a pregnant woman without a husband, without protection, without dignity in their eyes, whispered about in low voices, judged by women who crossed the road to avoid her, pitied by men who smiled with hidden cruelty, and she accepted it all in silence because silence had become her armor, the only thing she had left after the powerful man who ruined her life walked away untouched, respected, untouchable, his name spoken with fear and admiration while hers was spoken with shame. When she dragged the unconscious stranger into her small wooden shed, her back screamed with pain and her hands shook so badly she could barely pour water into his mouth, and when he finally opened his eyes they were empty, confused, frightened, like a child waking up in a world he didn't recognize, and he looked at her not with desire or judgment or suspicion, but with pure helplessness, and that look broke something open inside her, because for once she was not the weak one in the room, for once someone needed her more than she needed them, and she whispered slowly, calmly, telling him he was safe, telling him not to be afraid, telling him her name even though she didn't expect him to remember it, and when he asked who he was, her heart tightened, because she realized he had nothing, not even a past to escape into, and she told him the truth, that she didn't know, that she had found him near the old road by the fields, soaked and bleeding, and that he had been asleep for a long time, and he closed his eyes like the effort of existing was already too much. Days passed slowly, painfully, like time itself was dragging its feet, and she hid him there, fed him from what little she had, cleaned his wounds with care, ignoring the gossip that already followed her every step, ignoring the way her body felt heavier each morning, the way her feet swelled, the way fear whispered at night that she was risking everything for a stranger who might leave the moment he remembered who he was, but she kept going, because patience was the only thing she had learned to do well, patience with hunger, patience with humiliation, patience with pain, patience with the quiet injustice of life, and he recovered slowly, learning how to walk again, how to hold a cup, how to smile in a shy, uncertain way that made her look away because it felt too intimate, too dangerous, and he listened when she spoke, really listened, something no one had done for her in a long time, and when he noticed her pregnancy for the first time, truly noticed it, his face didn't change, didn't harden, didn't judge, he simply asked if she was okay, and that question almost made her cry. He never asked about the father, never pushed, never hinted, and she never explained, because some truths were too heavy to carry out loud, and in that quiet space between them something gentle began to grow. Not love at first, not romance, but trust, slow and fragile, built from shared silence, from evenings sitting outside watching the sky darken, from simple laughter when he struggled with memories that wouldn't return, from the way he helped her gather potatoes even when his body still ached, from the way he stood between her and rude stares at the market without realizing he was doing it, and for the first time since everything had fallen apart, she felt something close to hope, quiet and cautious, like a candle shielded from the wind. But the world does not like fragile peace, especially when powerful men have secrets to protect, and far away, in a city that didn't care about her village or her suffering, a man who owned factories, land, and politicians was growing impatient, because something precious had gone missing, something that belonged to him, and when whispers reached him about a man found near the fields with no memory, living with a pregnant woman everyone already looked down on, he smiled slowly, confidently, because he knew that no matter how time passed, the truth always returned to those who believed themselves untouchable, and he began to move his pieces, quietly at first, with money and influence, while she sat on the steps of her shed one evening, feeling the baby kick, watching the man she had saved struggle to remember his own name, and for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was not meant to suffer forever, not knowing that patience would soon be tested in ways she never imagined, and that love, once found, would demand a price far greater than silence. He began to remember small things first, not names or faces, but feelings, the weight of authority in his posture, the instinct to command rather than ask, the way his voice sometimes hardened without meaning to, and she noticed it even when she pretended not to, noticed how he sometimes stood straighter, how his eyes would drift toward the distant road as if expecting someone to come for him, and that scared her, because patience teaches you to fear change, especially when peace is fragile. And still she stayed calm, still she cooked, cleaned, worked, rested when her body forced her to, and spoke gently to him, because she knew fear could destroy what hope had quietly built, and in the village the whispers grew louder, sharper, crueler. People said she was hiding a man, that the child wasn't innocent, that shame followed her like a shadow, and she bore it all with lowered eyes and steady steps, because survival had taught her that reacting only fed cruelty. The man with no memory began helping more, repairing broken fences, carrying heavy sacks she should not lift, standing beside her when men stared too long, and sometimes at night he would sit awake, holding his head, whispering that something dark was chasing him, something powerful, and she would sit beside him, her swollen belly between them, telling him he was safe, even when she wasn't sure it was true, and slowly, without either of them naming it, love took shape. Not loud or dramatic, but deep and terrifying, the kind that makes you imagine a future you are afraid to lose. And when he placed his hand on her belly one evening and felt the baby move, his breath caught, his eyes filled with something close to awe, and he said quietly that whoever this child was, they were lucky to have her. And she turned her face away so he wouldn't see the tears, because no one had ever said that about her before. But patience does not stop destiny, and one morning strangers arrived in the village, polished shoes in mud, expensive coats, voices that carried authority, and she felt it before she saw it, that cold tightening in her chest that comes when injustice approaches again, and they asked questions, polite at first, about a man matching a description, and when he saw them his body reacted before his mind did, his jaw tightened, his shoulders squared, and something dangerous flickered behind his eyes, and she knew then that the past he had lost was not gentle, not small, not something that would quietly fade away, and when the men left she asked him what he felt, and he said he didn't know, only that he felt owned, hunted, and that terrified him more than not knowing who he was. The powerful man did not come himself, not yet, because men like him never dirty their hands unless they must. Instead he sent pressure, money, threats disguised as kindness, and the village changed overnight. People who once ignored her suddenly watched closely. Doors closed, help disappeared, and she understood that influence moves faster than truth, and that no matter how patient you are, power bends the world around it, and still she waited, believing that if she stayed quiet long enough, if she protected what little happiness she had, the storm might pass, but storms do not pass when someone wants what they believe belongs to them. And one evening, as she struggled with pain stronger than before, the kind that steals your breath, the men returned, this time without smiles, and they told him it was time to come home, that his real life was waiting, and when she looked at him she saw the truth settling in his eyes like a cruel sunrise, recognition, memory, authority returning piece by piece, and he whispered her name for the first time without hesitation, and that broke her heart, because memory had finally come back, and with it, the truth that love was never meant to survive power without a fight. They told her nothing directly, because people like her were never addressed unless necessary, but she heard enough, fragments of respect in their voices when they spoke to him, fear when they mentioned his family name, and she understood then why he had felt heavy even when silent, why authority clung to him like a shadow, and when they left again, promising to return, the shed felt smaller, the air thinner, and he sat across from her with his hands shaking, finally speaking the truth as memory locked into place, telling her he was the son of a powerful industrialist, raised in control, trained to obey strength, taught that feelings were weaknesses, and that his disappearance had caused chaos in a world she would never be allowed to enter. And she listened without interrupting, without pleading, because patience had taught her that begging never changed outcomes. And when he finished, she placed her hand on her belly and said quietly that she already knew what it meant, that worlds like his did not make space for women like her, or children born from shame, and he tried to protest, tried to promise protection, money, escape, but she stopped him with a look, because injustice had already taught her the cost of believing powerful men. The powerful man came the next day himself, arriving like a king inspecting forgotten land, his presence bending everyone around him, eyes lowering, back straightening, and when he saw her he smiled with polite cruelty, the kind that humiliates without raising its voice, and he congratulated her on her bravery for saving his son, then corrected himself, his property, and offered her compensation, generous by any measure, enough to disappear, enough to stay quiet forever, and the village watched, waiting for her to accept, because that is how stories like hers usually end, but she stood still, her body aching, her heart breaking, and said nothing, because silence can be resistance when words are useless, and that silence angered him more than shouting ever could. He leaned closer and reminded her who she was, what she was, how quickly rumors could become weapons, how easily a child could be taken, how laws favored those who funded them, and helplessness wrapped around her chest again like it had months before, familiar and suffocating, and she felt the baby move as if sensing danger, and in that moment she understood that patience had reached its limit, not because she wanted revenge, but because survival demanded courage, and when the man ordered his guards to take his son away, she did not scream, did not chase, she simply said one sentence that stopped everyone, that the child she carried was not a secret, that the truth he feared was already written in blood and memory, and that she had learned long ago that powerful men fall hardest when they underestimate silence. The village murmured, confusion spreading, and the powerful man laughed at first, dismissive, until she reached into her pocket and handed over the worn pendant he had once given her months ago, proof of a night he had erased from his own story but which had destroyed hers, and the color drained from his face, because power can erase people, but it cannot erase evidence, and for the first time, the untouchable man looked afraid, not of scandal, but of exposure, and his son watched, torn between worlds, realizing that the woman he loved was not weak, not a victim, but the quiet center of a storm he had never known was coming, and justice, long delayed, finally stirred, slow but unstoppable, like dawn after a long, cruel night. The powerful man tried to recover his smile, tried to turn the moment back into control, but silence had already done its work, because people were listening now, not just the village, but those who had come with him, men who understood contracts, scandals, consequences, and she spoke calmly, her voice steady despite the pain tightening her body, telling the truth she had carried alone for so long, how he had used his influence, his promises, his protection to take what he wanted and erase her afterward, how she had been left with shame while he kept his name clean, and how saving his son had not been fate or romance, but a reminder that power does not choose who carries its sins, and the son stepped forward then, not as an heir, not as a possession, but as a man who finally remembered who he was and who he did not want to become, and he said he would not leave, not without her, not without the truth, and that sentence cracked something open that money never could, because for the first time, the powerful man was defied publicly by his own blood. What followed was not loud justice, not instant punishment, but real justice, slow and undeniable. Lawyers called, statements made, witnesses remembered old rumors that suddenly made sense, and influence shifted the way it always does when risk appears, and the man who once owned silence found himself surrounded by it instead, and days later, when the dust settled, she sat outside her shed again, tired, swollen, breathing through pain as the first signs of labor began, and the man she had saved knelt beside her, holding her hand, not promising the world, not speaking of wealth or escape, only saying he would stay, whatever staying meant now, and when the child was born, quietly, without celebration, without cameras, without applause, she held new life in her arms knowing that patience had not been weakness, that silence had not been surrender, and that justice does not always arrive as revenge, sometimes it arrives as truth finally being heard, and for the first time since the rain-soaked day she pulled a stranger from the mud, she allowed herself to rest, because she was no longer invisible, no longer alone, and no longer afraid of what tomorrow might bring.